The torches along Alexandria's marble colonnades burned low, their gold light flickering in the salt-rich wind drifting from the harbor. Beyond the palace's open courtyard, a hush had fallen, the kind of silence born not of peace, but of anticipation. Tonight, Egypt's queen had summoned a guest who could shift the balance between empire and crown. Within her private audience chamber, shadows played across silk-draped walls the color of deep wine. Cleopatra reclined on a low, carved bench, her shoulders bare beneath a short-draped linen gown that shimmered like moonlit sand. Around her thigh coiled a golden serpent, its jeweled eyes catching the light with a glint of something unspoken. The Roman general entered without the clatter of armor, though the faint scent of iron still clung to him. His stride was confident, yet his gaze betrayed a man caught between duty and something far less certain. "Does it bite?" he asked, eyes lingering on the serpent's coiled gleam. A faint, knowing smile curved her lips. "Only those who dare," she murmured, her voice smooth as carved alabaster. Their eyes held hers, the deliberate challenge of a ruler who knew the weight of silence. His the careful measure of a man who had seen battlefields and yet sensed that here the war would be of an entirely different kind. Outside, the Mediterranean murmured against the palace walls, as if the sea itself leaned in to hear what would be said next. The city was a mirror of its ruler, dazzling, layered, and endlessly watchful. In the market stalls, merchants passed gossip along with pomegranates. In the marble corridors of the palace, servants traded whispers in the shadows. And at the center of those whispers was the Roman general, who had been granted a private audience. A luxury that even Alexandria's oldest allies rarely enjoyed. Cleopatra carried herself through the corridors, as if none of it touched her. Draped in a short linen gown the color of pale honey, her hair coiled in braids, edged with gold. She met each gaze with the calm authority of a ruler, who understood that curiosity was as much a tool as a threat. From his vantage in the shaded peristyle, the general noticed the way she seemed to command the very air around her. Rome had taught him to assess leaders quickly, their strengths, their weaknesses, their dangers. Yet here was a queen whose power wasn't simply her throne, nor her beauty, but the way she blurred the line between the two until they were indivisible. That night, over a modest supper in the officers' hall, he felt every stare from his fellow soldiers. Their questions remained unspoken, but their eyes asked all the same. "What passed between you and the Queen of Egypt?" He offered no answer. Not yet. The harbor at dawn was a living mosaic. Crimson sails unfurled against a sky still washed with the pale lavender of night's retreat. From the balcony of his quarters, the Roman general leaned on the stone balustrade, watching the day awaken over Alexandria. The city breathed differently here than in Rome. In Egypt, life moved to the rhythm of the river and the rise of the sun. Yet beneath the surface was the constant undercurrent of strategy, of eyes that measured every gesture, and he knew many of those eyes had turned on him since that private meeting with the queen. In the stillness, he found himself replaying it. The way her smile had been almost imperceptible, but utterly deliberate. The serpent's jeweled eyes catching the torchlight, the careful weight of her words, as if each syllable had been chosen as a test. Rome had taught him to read the art of influence. He'd seen senators sway whole assemblies with a single pause, generals rally legions with a single phrase. Yet Cleopatra was another kind of tactician. Her battlefields were subtle, her victories almost invisible until the moment you realized you had been outflanked. By the water's edge, fishermen called to one another, their laughter rolling on the tide. He wondered, briefly, what it would be to live without the constant pull of empires. But the thought faded as quickly as it came. Men like him, and women like her, belonged to the storm, not the shore. A knock came at his door, breaking the thread of his thoughts. A servant delivered a summons, sealed with the crest of the Ptolemaic crown. Another audience with the queen, and with it, another step into waters from which he might not return unchanged. The garden within the palace walls was a world apart from the city outside, enclosed by limestone colonnades, fragrant with night-blooming jasmine, and lit by the gentle sway of bronze lanterns. The warm air carried the faint song of a lyre from some distant chamber, mingling with the rustle of palm fronds. Above, Cleopatra stood at the edge of the lotus pond, her reflection swaying in the black glass water. She wore a sleeveless linen gown that fell to just above her knees, cinched at the waist with a slender belt of woven gold. A thin circlet crowned her dark hair, and moonlight traced a silver edge along her profile. The Roman general approached quietly, but not quietly enough to escape her awareness. Without turning, she spoke. "In Rome, do gardens ever breathe in the night like this?" He stepped closer, inhaling the mingled scents of lotus, myrrh, and citrus. "In Rome," he said, The gardens sleep. Here, they seem to watch. She turned to face him then, her gaze lingering for a fraction longer than courtesy demanded. Egypt watches all who enter her gates, she replied, but you, she seems willing to keep. They walked along a path lined with papyrus and flowering hibiscus. Words came slowly, the measured phrases of two people accustomed to weighing every syllable for power. Yet, in the soft light, those words held something warmer than politics. As they paused beside the fountain, she trailed her fingers along the cool stone, droplets catching on her skin. He found himself wishing, with a twinge of danger, to be counted among the few things in this land that could touch her freely. From somewhere beyond the garden walls, the harbor bells rang. A reminder that even in moments like this, the world beyond still moved, plotting its next turn. The summons had been brief, the messenger wordless. When the general returned to his quarters that evening, the first thing he saw was the package on his table. No seal, no accompanying letter. It was light in his hands, wrapped in papyrus and tied with a simple knot. Inside lay a length of Egyptian silk, so fine, it seemed to shift with every breath of air. Gold threads woven through in intricate serpentine patterns. The fabric was cool at first touch, but warmed quickly in his palm, holding its shape when he let it drape across his fingers. He knew enough of court custom to understand that such a gift was not chosen lightly. A ruler could send gold, could send wine, but silk like this was language without words, a statement that could mean loyalty, challenge, or invitation. He lifted the silk to his face and caught the faintest trace of something floral, elusive, familiar. Myrrh and lotus. The same subtle perfume he had noticed when she passed him in the garden. In the torchlit stillness, he remembered her smile, the serpent's golden coil, and the promise in her eyes. This was no idle gesture. It was a thread, deliberately placed, daring him to see where it might lead. He folded the silk carefully, sliding it into the inner compartment of his armor case. Whatever the coming days held, diplomacy, battle, or both, this reminder of her would be close to his heart, pressed between steel and skin. And somewhere in the palace, he was certain, Cleopatra already knew exactly where he would keep it. The banquet hall was a forest of stone, towering columns painted in deep lapis and rich vermilion, their carved capitals blooming like papyrus in the torchlight. Golden braziers breathed warmth into the air, mingling with the scent of roasted lamb, figs, and spiced wine. Musicians played from an alcove, their harps and flutes weaving melodies that curled through the hall like smoke. The Roman general stood among his fellow envoys, posture taut but gaze subtly, searching for the queen. She did not keep him waiting long. Cleopatra entered at the head of her court, her short draped gown of crimson linen gathered with a clasp shaped like a coiled serpent. Jeweled sandals flashed as she crossed the inlaid floor. Every head bowed, except his when the formalities had passed. The master of ceremonies called for the ceremonial dance. Cleopatra extended her hand to the general, her bangles chiming softly with the movement. In the measured pattern of court steps, they moved beneath the columns. Her hand was light in his, yet carried a sovereign's command. Between phrases of polite diplomacy, talk of trade winds, troop movements, and Rome's harvest, there were silences threaded with something far older than politics. Once, as they turned, her gaze caught his fully. It was the same look she had given when she'd first spoken of the serpent. A challenge wrapped in allure. As if to say, you will step carefully here, soldier. The dance ended to polite applause. She withdrew her hand with a bow so slight it was almost imperceptible, before returning to her throne. But the air between them still carried the rhythm they'd shared, and in his mind, the music had not yet stopped. The Queen's private council chamber was a space reserved for the most delicate of matters, a circular room lined with carved cedar panels and maps inked on stretched papyrus. The air smelled faintly of sandalwood and hot wax from the single lamp that burned on the central table. When the Roman general arrived, Cleopatra was already there, seated with her back to the light so her face emerged gradually from shadow. In front of her lay a scroll, its ends capped in gold, sealed with a stamp bearing the royal cartouche. She rose, crossing the room with a quiet grace, and placed it in his hands. "This," she said, her voice low, "is a message for my most trusted ally in Thebes. It contains terms that, if intercepted, could unravel more than you know. You will deliver it yourself." He weighed the scroll, aware of the meaning behind the task. This was no mere courier's errand. It was an unspoken test, the kind only rulers and commanders understood. "You trust me with this," he said, more statement than question. Her eyes held his, steady and searching. "Egypt does," she replied. And Egypt does not extend trust lightly. The seal was cool beneath his fingers, but he felt the heat of the moment. Not in her touch, but in the dangerous thread binding their fates tighter. Somewhere deep within the palace, a gong sounded to mark the passing hour. But here, in this quiet chamber, time itself seemed to pause, waiting to see if he would prove worthy of the charge placed upon him. The river ran high that season, its surface burnished with late summer light, but the mood in the palace was far from golden. From the south came word of unrest. A Roman envoy newly arrived in Alexandria carried orders that would cut Egypt's autonomy to the bone. Cleopatra sat in the Hall of Maps, the long table spread with charts of harbors and grain routes. Her counselors spoke in quick, anxious tones, tracing lines of trade and tribute that would now run through Roman hands. She listened, chin resting lightly on her hand, as though weighing more than commerce. The general stood apart, a silent figure in the chamber's corner, watching her. She glanced at him only once, but that single look was enough to draw him into her private war. He had seen her in the garden, in the dance hall, in the quiet of trust. And here was yet another Cleopatra, a ruler forged from steel and sunlight. A gust rattled the shutters, bringing in the smell of rain. He imagined the Nile swelling further upstream, waters pressed hard against their banks, as if the river itself strained against invisible chains. When the council broke, she called him aside. "Rome will test me," she said, "and by testing me, they will test you." It was not a plea, it was a warning, and a promise, carried on the same breath. The palace gardens were different at night, the perfumes richer, the shadows deeper, the air touched with an intimacy that daylight could never hold. High above, a half-moon floated like a silver coin against a velvet sky, casting a cool glow across the limestone balustrades. The general had been summoned without escort, led only by the whisper of sandals ahead of him. When the servant left, he found himself on a quiet balcony overlooking the dark shimmer of the Mediterranean. Cleopatra emerged from the shadows, as if the moon had called her forth. Her gown was light, short enough to ease the weight of the summer heat, a pale fabric that caught every glint of silver in the night. No crown adorned her head now, only a loose braid falling across one shoulder. "Rome sleeps," she said softly, joining him at the railing. "But Egypt listens." They stood side by side, the silence between them filled with the distant song of waves against the harbor wall. She spoke of the constellations as if they were old friends, tracing them in the air with a graceful hand. He watched her profile, struck by the way the light softened her strength without dimming it. A gust of wind swept in from the sea, carrying the faint scent of myrrh. She glanced at him, the corner of her mouth lifting just enough to suggest amusement, or invitation. Somewhere below, a guard's spear tapped against stone, the sound a reminder that the rest of the world still existed. But here, high above the city, they might have been the only two souls awake. The sun rose over Alexandria in a sheet of gold, spilling down narrow streets and across the tiled roofs of the merchant quarter. The city was alive with the voices of traders haggling over bolts of linen, the calls of fishermen displaying silver-scaled catch, and the spice-heavy breeze that wound through every alley. The general was early to the rendezvous, dressed not in his military tunic but in a plain cotton robe, a hood drawn low to shadow his features. Even so, his posture gave him away to any trained eye. A soldier moves differently, even without his armor. When she appeared, it was without crown or retinue. Cleopatra had bound her dark hair in a simple wrap, her gown modest yet cut short enough to ease her stride in the heat. In her hands, she carried a basket of figs, as though she had stepped out only to buy fruit and not to test the boundaries between queen and man. "Keep your eyes open," she murmured as they joined the crowd. "You'll see more truth here than in any throne room." They passed stalls heavy with dates, jars of honey, baskets of perfumed oils. She paused to taste a sliver of pomegranate offered by an old woman, her smile genuine, her words warm. He watched the way people responded to her, not just with deference, but with something like devotion. In a shaded corner of the market, they lingered by a map seller's stall. Her fingers hovered over parchment depictions of the Nile, the Red Sea, and coastlines beyond. "Every mark," she said quietly, "is a promise, or a warning." The noise of the market swelled around them, but in that narrow space, it felt as though the day itself held its breath. The summons, when it came, was unspoken. No scroll, no words. Only a small wooden box left on the general's table, its ivory inlay glinting in the lamplight. He sat alone when he opened it. Inside, on a bed of crimson silk, lay a ring. Gold, heavy, its band carved into the form of a coiled serpent. The detail was exquisite. Scales etched, so fine they caught the light like rippling water. Twin emerald eyes, gleaming with that same unsettling promise he had first seen on the queen herself. He turned the ring in his hand, noting the way it seemed to warm against his skin, as if it had been worn only moments before. A thought struck him. The serpent clasp on her thigh that night in the chamber. The sly glint of gold against linen. This was no mere ornament. It was a sign, one that bound him to her in a language older than treaties. Sliding it onto his finger, he found it fit perfectly, as though it had been measured in secret. It was a claim without proclamation, a mark that would be recognized by those who understood Egypt's symbols, and questioned by those who did not. From beyond the balcony, the murmur of Alexandria drifted in. The creak of ships in the harbor, the distant call of a night vendor, the sea breathing against stone. Yet beneath it all, he felt the quiet pull of the queen's intent, coiled now around his hand like the serpent itself. And in that silent moment, he realized he was already wearing the first piece of his allegiance. The night was a spectacle designed to impress, to deceive. Torches blazed along the colonnades, their light catching on bronze shields, hung purely for decoration. Musicians played in the gallery above, their rhythms timed to the ebb and swell of conversation. Every surface gleamed. The polished marble floor, the gold-leafed goblets, even the eyes of the watching courtiers. Cleopatra sat enthroned on the dais. Her gown of deep emerald linen cut to the knee, edged in gold fringe, that shimmered with each shift of her posture. Around her neck hung a collar of lapis and turquoise, an unspoken declaration of wealth and power. The Roman general had been seated closer to her than most foreign guests, a choice that did not go unnoticed. Across the table from them, a visiting envoy from a rival province spoke honeyed words, his tone courteous but his phrasing calculated. Between sips of wine, he laid out a treaty that would quietly siphon Egypt's grain supply into his allies' coffers. It was an ambush, dressed in civility. Cleopatra's smile never faltered. She let him build his web, listening with a patience that was itself a weapon. Then, with a single question framed as idle curiosity, she pulled a thread, loose pointing out, as though in passing, that his clauses contradicted Rome's own decrees. Laughter rippled through the table as his composure cracked. The general watched, recognizing the tactics of a seasoned commander. This was not seduction, nor flattery, it was strategy in its purest form. As the banquet wore on, the envoy's confidence ebbed. When the final toast was raised, the treaty lay forgotten, its trap exposed for all to see. From her place at the dais, Cleopatra caught the general's eye. It was not the look of a woman celebrating a simple victory, it was the look of one setting the next move in play. The palace's inner courtyard slept beneath a canopy of stars. In the center lay the pool, a mirror of obsidian water, its edges lined with white marble and lanterns whose flames swayed with the night breeze. Cleopatra stood barefoot at the edge, her gown short enough to brush just above her knees, the fabric light and loose in the warm air. She trailed her fingertips along the surface, drawing lazy ripples that caught the lantern light like liquid gold. The general approached without the stiff formality of the throne room. His steps on the marble echoed softly before being swallowed by the stillness. Here there were no courtiers, no rivals, no listening walls. Only the night, the water, and the two of them. "You move through the palace like a shadow," she said, her voice low, a faint smile curving her lips. "Shadows are harder to strike," he replied. And she glanced at him, eyes reflecting the lamplight, and let a quiet pause stretch between them. Somewhere beyond the courtyard, a night bird called. The sound was distant, almost fragile. They walked slowly along the pool's edge, their voices dipping into fragments of conversation. The state of the southern garrisons, the unrest in Rome, memories of cities far from here. Now and again, their shoulders nearly brushed. As they paused beneath an arch of carved stone, she looked at him fully. "Some wars are not fought with swords," she said, almost to herself. The general understood she was not speaking of politics alone. And in the hush that followed, the pool seemed to hold its breath along with them. In the quiet of his chambers, with only the flame of a single oil lamp for company, the general sat before a sheet of fresh papyrus. Outside, the palace slept, the muffled footsteps of the night guard, the only sign that life still moved beyond his walls. He dipped his reed pen into the ink, pausing before the first stroke. What he was about to write would travel across seas and deserts to the Senate in Rome. Every word would be weighed, not just by the men who sat in its marbled halls, but by history itself. His orders were to report on Egypt's stability, its ruler's reliability, the potential for greater Roman oversight. Yet, as he began to shape his sentences, Cleopatra's face hovered unbidden in his mind. The poise with which he dismantled the banquet trap, the quiet strength in the garden, the fierce light in her eyes when she spoke of Egypt's sovereignty. He found himself softening his phrasing, choosing to frame her as a sovereign partner rather than a queen in need of Roman guidance. The ink glistened under the lamplight, each word an act of subtle defiance against the hotter voices in his homeland. When at last he laid down the pen, he read the letter once more. It was both a soldier's report and an unspoken shield, protection for her realm, and perhaps for the fragile thread between them. He sealed it with his personal crest and placed it on the table's edge, knowing the courier would collect it before dawn. As the lamp guttered low, he allowed himself one final thought before sleep claimed him: that some battles could be fought, and even won, with nothing more than ink, parchment, and the memory of a queen's gaze. The first light of day had barely brushed the palace walls when the quiet shattered. From the eastern garden came the sharp clash of metal, the urgent cry of guards, and the startled shriek of peacocks scattering into the air. The general was already moving, sword in hand, before his feet found the floor. He followed the sound into the colonnaded walk, the air heavy with the scent of crushed jasmine underfoot. Ahead, 3 figures in dark cloaks broke from the shadows, blades flashing. Cleopatra stood at the center of the garden path, flanked only by 2 startled attendants, her short linen cloak thrown carelessly over her shoulders. She did not retreat. Her gaze was cold, assessing, the look of a queen weighing the price of each heartbeat. The first attacker lunged, but the general's strike was swift and decisive, steel ringing against steel. A second rushed him. Their blades met in a flurry of sparks. The third, perhaps seeing the odds shift, turned toward Cleopatra herself, only to freeze at the sight of her hand, gripping a slender dagger. Its hilt, shaped like the serpent that seemed to follow her into every battlefield, seen or unseen. In moments, it was over. The assailants lay disarmed, 1 wounded, 2 captured by the rushing palace guard. The air settled again, though the tension hung thick as the scent of blood on the jasmine. Cleopatra stepped toward him, her voice quiet but firm. "You were quick," she said. "Quicker than my enemies expected." He sheathed his blade, meeting her eyes. "I've learned to rise with the sun," he replied. Her gaze lingered a fraction longer, an unspoken acknowledgement that, in the shifting tides of power, speed could be the line between survival and the end of a dynasty. The surviving attacker knelt on the mosaic floor of the audience chamber, wrists bound with rough rope. Blood still stained his tunic from the shallow wound along his side, but his eyes were defiant, darting from the guards to the tall windows where dawn's first light crept in. Cleopatra entered without haste. She wore a short, white linen gown belted in gold, a mantle of sheer fabric draped lightly over her shoulders. The serpent clasp at her hip winked in the sunlight, as though it, too, was measuring the intruder. The court expected a swift sentence. Mercy was not the usual currency in matters of attempted regicide. Yet Cleopatra descended the dais slowly, her bare feet whispering against the floor, and stopped directly before the man. "Who sent you?" she asked. He spat on the floor in reply. A murmur rippled through the gathered counselors. The general, standing at her right hand, was already prepared to have the man dragged away, but she raised a single hand, stilling him. "Tell your masters," she said, her voice low, but carrying through the hall, "that Egypt's queen is not so easily slain, and that her generosity has spared you." Once, gasps met her words. It was not forgiveness. It was a warning dressed in grace. The man was released under guard, to be escorted beyond the city gates before sunset. In the corridor after, the general walked beside her. "You let him live," he said, more observation than question. Cleopatra's eyes were fixed ahead. "Fear makes enemies reckless," she replied. "Mercy makes them cautious." And with that, she moved on, already turning her thoughts to the next move in a game far larger than one failed blade. Alexandria pulsed with life. The festival of Isis transformed the city into a living tapestry of color and sound. Sails dyed crimson and gold lining the harbor, streets strewn with lotus blossoms, drums echoing from every square. Incense drifted in ribbons through the hot midday air, carrying prayers to the goddess who guarded both river and crown. From the palace balcony, Cleopatra watched the processions wind their way through the city. Below, priests in white linen carried gilded statues on poles. Dancers spun in rhythms older than the stones beneath their feet, and children scattered petals ahead of the parade. When evening came, the palace's grand courtyard opened to the people. Lanterns bobbed overhead like captured stars. Cleopatra descended the marble steps, her gown cut above the knee for freedom of movement. The fabric light enough to shimmer with each turn of her body. Upon her brow sat a delicate circlet, shaped like the crescent moon of Isis. The Roman general found her in the crowd. Tonight she wore no throne between them, no guard at her side, only the thrumming of music and the unspoken permission in her eyes. She took a mask from a tray, painted gold, with the stylized eyes of the goddess, and placed it over his face with her own hands. They danced as the drums rose, turning among courtiers, sailors, merchants, and priests alike. Each step was a wordless conversation. Each glance, another piece moved on an unseen board. Behind the anonymity of masks, they were free to draw nearer than courtly etiquette would allow. When the last note faded, she leaned close. So close he caught the faint perfume of lotus and myrrh. Even the goddess, she murmured, knows when war must yield to celebration. Then she was gone into the crowd, leaving him with the mask still warm from her touch. Morning light spilled into the council chamber, pooling on the polished floor like molten amber. The scent of last night's incense still clung faintly to the air, a reminder of the revelry that had only just faded. Outside, Alexandria was shaking off its hangover in the chatter of the markets and the rhythmic splash of oars against the harbor. Cleopatra sat at the long cedar table, the serpent-shaped clasp at her hip, catching the sun in green-gold flashes. Before her lay a scroll bearing the seal of a Roman senator known for his influence and his price. She pushed it toward the general. "You will take this to Lucius Pharaoh," she said, her tone brisk but measured. "He is pragmatic. Tell him Egypt seeks neither defiance nor servitude, only partnership." The general turned the seal in his fingers. "And if he demands more than partnership?" Her gaze met his, unwavering. "Then you will give him truth, and the weight of your own voice beside it. He trusts Rome's soldiers more than Egypt's queen. I trust you to bridge that distance." The journey to Pharaoh's private villa was short, but heavy with calculation. The meeting that followed was a dance of words. The general pressing Egypt's stability and value. Pharaoh circling like a merchant, appraising goods. When he returned that evening, the courtyard was empty, save for Cleopatra, standing with her hands clasped lightly before her. His report was simple. He will not interfere. For now, she nodded once, as if she had expected nothing more. Yet there was a glint in her eyes. Not relief, but the satisfaction of moving another piece across the board, exactly where she wanted it. The Chamber of Maps was a sanctum for rulers and generals alike, a place where the fate of nations could be traced in strokes of ink. Its walls were lined with scrolls cataloging decades of Nile floods, trade winds, and caravan routes. The great cedar table in the center was covered with a sprawling map of Egypt and its neighboring lands, each line drawn in painstaking detail. Cleopatra stood at one end, the soft lamplight gilding the curve of her cheek and the edge of her short linen gown. A thin reed pointer rested in her hand, tapping lightly on Alexandria's harbor. "This," she said, "is the heart. Rome covets it not only for its grain, but because whoever holds Alexandria commands the sea." The general moved to stand opposite her, his calloused fingers tracing the Red Sea coastline. "And here," he replied, "a fleet could intercept every shipment before it leaves Egyptian waters." Their hands met over the delta, a brief touch, but enough for both to feel the spark. She didn't move hers at first, letting the moment linger like a pause between breaths. They began to plot in earnest, shifting weights on miniature ships carved from ebony, marking safe passages in green, and points of vulnerability in red. He admired the precision of her mind, quick, adaptive, unafraid to redraw the lines when needed. At one point, she leaned over the table, her braid spilling forward. The serpent clasped at her thigh, winking in the lamplight. "Borders are not just lines," she said. "They are promises, or they are threats. The difference depends on who draws them." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Inside, the air was still, heavy with ink, maps, and the quiet knowledge that in that moment, the two of them were charting more than just Egypt's future. The rains came early that year, sweeping in from the sea with a restless wind that rattled the shutters of the palace and churned the harbor into a froth of white-tipped waves. Inside the hall of columns, the air felt just as unsettled. Rumors had begun to curl through the corridors like smoke. Whispers of the general meeting with Roman envoys in secret, of messages exchanged beyond the queen's knowledge. Cleopatra listened without outward reaction, but the lines of tension in her jaw told their own story. Trust, she knew, was both a jewel and a blade. Once cracked, It could never be repaired without leaving a mark. When they met that evening in her private salon, the conversation was formal at first. Weather, troop movements, the state of the grain silos. But beneath the measured words lay something brittle. "You've been busy," she said at last, her gaze fixed not on him, but on the storm outside the tall windows. "I serve Egypt," he replied evenly. "Even when Egypt is not looking." Her eyes flicked to his then, sharp and searching, as if she could read the truth directly from his expression. A roll of thunder broke the silence, the sound echoing against the marble like the crack of distant artillery. It struck him then, how easily the current between them could shift, from alliance to suspicion, from closeness to guarded distance. And yet, even in that charged air, the pull toward her remained, as inevitable as the tide. She turned back to the storm. "Winds change," she murmured. "The wise learn to adjust their sails before they tear." He left that night aware that the danger he faced was no longer only from Rome's ambitions or Egypt's enemies, but from the delicate, treacherous territory of the Queen's trust. The war tent was lit only by a brazier's low flame, shadows pooling in its corners like gathered secrets. Outside, the camp stirred restlessly. Horses stamped in their tethers, and the distant clang of weapons being readied was the drumbeat of an approaching storm. The general stood in full armor, the serpent-marked ring glinting faintly on his finger. Maps lay spread on the table before him, each one a promise of what the next days would demand. Cleopatra entered without a herald, the flap of the tent falling closed behind her. She wore a short-sleeved mantle over a gown cut to the knee, its hem dusted from her walk across the camp. Her presence was at once out of place and entirely at home, as though she were here to command a fleet rather than grace a court. They spoke first of troop numbers, supply lines, and the Roman banners spotted at Riva. Her voice was steady, but each sentence seemed to shorten the distance between them until she was beside the table, her hand resting near the edge of the map. "You ride at dawn," she said, her gaze fixed on his. He nodded once. "We'll hold the line." For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then she reached up. Not the measured gesture of a queen, but the sure claim of a woman who knew the weight of farewell, and drew him down to her. The kiss was brief, fierce, and without promise of when or whether another would follow. When she stepped back, her hand lingered on his cheek, her eyes searching his face as if committing it to memory. "Bring me back my victory," she whispered. And then she was gone, leaving only the scent of lotus and smoke to keep him company in the silent hours before battle. The battlefield lay just beyond the date groves, where the desert met the slow, silt-heavy curve of the Nile. By noon, the sun blazed high, bleaching the sand to white and glinting off the lines of shields. The air was alive with the clash of bronze, the shouts of commands, the whinny of horses breaking formation. The general fought at the front, his sword an extension of muscle and will. Each strike was measured, each movement efficient. But behind the rhythm of combat was a steady pull toward the thought of the woman in Alexandria, waiting for news that might never come. When the tide of battle finally broke, it was Egypt's banner that rose first above the fray. The Roman advance faltered, their commander taken, their lines driven back toward the riverbank. Victory belonged to Cleopatra's forces that day. Yet, as the dust began to settle, he saw the cost. Rows of Egyptian soldiers lay still beneath the pitiless sky, their armor dulled with sand and blood. The wind carried the bitter smell of iron, sharp against the sweetness of crushed dates underfoot. By the time the survivors returned to the city, the light was fading, casting Alexandria in hues of copper and rose. In the great hall, Cleopatra awaited them, her gown a brilliant white that stood out like a flame in the gathering dark. He knelt before her, offering the laurel crown taken from the defeated Roman commander. "The line holds," he said. Her gaze softened, but only for an instant. She took the crown, set it aside, and placed her hand briefly on his shoulder, the gesture of a ruler to her champion, and something more to the man beneath the armor. "Egypt stands," she said, "and so do you." The harbor was quiet at sunset, its usual clamor muted as though the city itself were catching its breath after news of victory. Fishing boats swayed gently in the evening tide, their sails furled, while gulls wheeled in the fading gold light. The general walked the length of the stone quay, the weight of his armor replaced now by a simpler tunic, though the serpent-marked ring still circled his finger. Each step seemed to draw away the roar of the battlefield, replacing it with the softer sound of waves against the pier. Cleopatra awaited him at the far end, a single attendant lingering at a discreet distance. She wore a gown the color of the Nile at dusk, deep blue, short enough for the breeze to stir its hem. In the cooling air, The faint scent of lotus followed her. They spoke at first of the campaign, his words measured, hers precise. Yet, as the light shifted and the horizon bled into violet, formality gave way to something quieter. They walked along the water's edge, the tide lapping at the stone like a heartbeat. At one point she stopped, gazing toward the sea. Wars end, she said softly, but the currents remain. He thought of the maps they had studied, of the invisible lines between land and loyalty, and how some could never be charted on parchment. When they parted that night, it was without the ceremony of the throne room or the heat of the war tent. Only a silence that carried both contentment and the ache of things left unspoken. Night fell heavy over the palace, the corridors lit only by oil lamps, whose flames wavered in the drafts between stone arches. Beyond the public halls, the air felt different, quieter, thicker, as if even the walls were listening. The general moved through the private wing on a quiet circuit, his footsteps softened by the woven reed mats underfoot. It was not his assigned duty, yet he had taken it upon himself to walk this route since the night of the ambush. He knew the patterns of the guards here, the faces of the servants, which was why the small changes unsettled him. A guard stationed where none had been the night before. A door left ajar when it should have been sealed. From a shadowed alcove above the courtyard, he saw Cleopatra crossing alone toward her sola, carrying a single lamp. The short train of her gown brushed the floor, the serpent clasp at her hip flashing in the unsteady light. He caught the faint echo of whispered voices somewhere nearby, too low to catch the words, but enough to raise his guard. Following the sound, he found the source. Two courtiers in hurried conversation, breaking apart the instant they saw him, bowing too quickly before vanishing down separate corridors. When he returned to Cleopatra's side, her expression told him she already suspected what he had begun to confirm, that someone within these walls was playing a dangerous game, one that might strike without warning. She met his gaze for a long moment. The strongest fortresses, she said quietly, are not always built of stone. And in that dimly lit hallway, both knew the battle ahead would be fought, not in the open, but in the unseen places, where loyalty could be masked in gold and betrayal in a bow. The Hall of Light earned its name from the great skylight that crowned its vaulted ceiling, pouring the Egyptian sun onto the marble floor below. It was here that Cleopatra had summoned the accused, 3 members of her court whose loyalty, once trusted, now stood in doubt. The assembly was silent but for the slow echo of her footsteps as she entered. She wore a gown of pale gold linen, short enough for ease of movement, its fabric catching every gleam of light. The serpent clasp at her hip glittered like a living thing in the brightness. The general stood at her right, silent sentinel and witness. He had gathered the fragments of proof, whispered meetings in unlit corridors, sealed letters exchanged with rival envoys, a pattern too deliberate to be dismissed. One by one, Cleopatra questioned them. Her voice was not loud, yet it filled the chamber, calm, precise, and carrying the weight of a ruler who expected truth. Under that gaze, words faltered, denials stuttered, and the careful masks of politeness began to crack. When at last the final silence fell, she spoke not to her guards, but to the hall itself. Treachery, she said, hides in shadows. Today, we stripped those shadows away. 2 of the accused were stripped of titles and property, exiled to estates far from Alexandria. The third, whose guilt was certain and whose betrayal had placed her throne at risk, was escorted out under the watch of the palace guard. His fate left unspoken, though the court understood. The light from above shifted as the sun moved on, casting the hall in softer gold. Cleopatra turned to the general, her eyes briefly meeting his. In that glance was both thanks and an unspoken warning. In this palace, trust would always be guarded like treasure. The gardens at dusk were a place between worlds, where day's authority loosened its grip, and night's intimacy had not yet claimed the air. The sun lingered low, painting the limestone walls in copper, while the fountains murmured in steady counterpoint to the hush that had settled over the palace. Cleopatra stood beneath a trellis heavy with jasmine, its perfume drifting on the warm breeze. She had set aside the golden gown of judgment for a simpler wrap of ivory linen that brushed just above her knees, a slim belt drawing it close to her frame. The serpent clasp was there still, glinting at her hip, a reminder that, even in repose, she remained armed. The general approached, without the formality of court. He carried no reports, no messages, only the quiet gravity of a man who had stood beside her in the light of accusation, and seen its cost. They sat together on a carved stone bench, the air between them rich with the scent of jasmine and the faint, metallic temps of the day's decisions. Neither spoke at first. The fountain's rhythm filled the silence, and for a time, that was enough. At last, Cleopatra's gaze lifted to meet his. "It is easy to rule when the guilty are strangers," she said. "It is harder when the faces are ones you have known." He studied her profile, the fine line between resolve and weariness. "You chose Egypt," he said. Her lips curved, not in amusement, but in acknowledgement. "Always." The last of the daylight slipped behind the palace walls, and the garden's lanterns began to glow. Still, they did not move, as if holding that shared stillness a little longer might keep the rest of the world at bay. The audience chamber was empty, but for them, no courtiers, no guards. Only the muted afternoon light filtering through the high lattice windows, painting the floor in patterns of gold. Cleopatra stood beside a low table of inlaid ebony. Upon it rested a small chest bound in bronze, its lock shaped like the head of a cobra. She wore a mantle of soft linen that left her arms bare, the hem brushing just above her knees. Attire not for court, but for a private moment between allies who had stood in fire together. When the general approached, she opened the chest without ceremony. From within, she drew a scroll case of hammered silver, its surface etched with scenes of the Nile's flood and the stars above Thebes. "This," she said, placing it in his hands, "holds Egypt's navigational charts. The true ones, not the copies we let our rivals believe are accurate. With these, a captain can ride the currents of the Nile as if guided by the gods." He understood at once what she was entrusting him with. In a land where trade, war, and survival all flowed with the river, such charts were more than treasure. They were sovereignty itself. "Why me?" he asked quietly. Her eyes held his, steady, unblinking. "Because when the choice came, you chose Egypt." He set the scroll case against his chest in a soldier's salute, feeling the cool weight of silver warm in his hands. No jewel, no title, no banner could have spoken louder than this silent mark of trust. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of the river. Within, neither moved, as though both knew this was one of those rare moments that would outlast the turning of empires. The silver scroll case lay on the general's table like a living thing, its etched rivers and constellations catching the lamplight as the hours slipped past. He had unsealed it only once since receiving it, unrolling the charts with care, tracing the Nile's currents as though they might whisper an answer to the question burning in him. Beyond the balcony, Alexandria slept under a thin veil of moonlight. From here, the harbor lights blinked like scattered embers, each one a reminder of the trade, the fleets, the lives that pulsed through Egypt's heart. The same fleets that Rome, in its hunger, would one day try to command. He could deliver the charts to his superiors in Rome, win favor, rise in rank, perhaps secure a future written in marble halls. Or he could keep them here, in Alexandria, binding his loyalty not to the Senate's ambition, but to the woman who had entrusted him with something she would not give to any foreign power. When dawn crept over the horizon, he had made no move to pack for departure. Instead, he wrapped the scroll case in linen and slid it into the hidden compartment beneath his armor, not for transport to Rome, but for safekeeping in the palace vaults. By the time the first light reached the city's rooftops, his choice was set. Whatever history would say of him, traitor to empire, or champion of Egypt, would be written by hands far in the future. For now, it was enough to know that when the wait came, he had chosen her. The first warnings came not from scouts or spies, but from the harbor itself. Merchant captains whispered of Roman ships sailing under half-furled banners, their holds empty, their decks bristling with soldiers. They anchored just beyond the line of the Pharaoh's light, close enough to watch the city, but far enough to claim innocence. In the council chamber, Cleopatra stood before the open lattice, letting the salt wind curl through her hair. The serpent clasp at her hip gleamed, but her shoulders were still. On the table behind her lay a folded sheet of parchment. The Senate's reply. The general read it in silence. They knew. The careful, almost casual phrasing could not soften the threat beneath. Rome was disappointed in his failure to forward certain intelligence. They hoped for swift resolution, and they had dispatched an envoy to restore mutual confidence. A phrase that meant chains, or worse. "You are always going to be tested," she said without turning. He stepped closer, the sound of the wind filling the pause. "And I made my choice." Her gaze shifted to the horizon, where the faint silhouettes of Roman masts rocked like patient predators. "Then we must make ours," she replied. Together. Somewhere in the palace, a gong sounded the hour. In the harbor, the ships did not move, but the city could feel the pressure of their presence, the way air changes before a sandstorm breaks. The audience chamber had been prepared with deliberate precision. No silks draped the walls, no musicians played. Only the hard gleam of polished stone, and the echo of footsteps crossing it. A single shaft of light cut down from the high windows, falling across the place where Cleopatra's throne sat waiting. The Roman envoy entered first. Tall, lean, his cloak clasped with an eagle of hammered bronze. Behind him trailed two scribes and a translator, though he spoke Greek well enough to make the latter unnecessary. Cleopatra received him seated, her gown of white linen edged in gold, the serpent at her hip glinting as she shifted her weight. The general stood at her right, an unspoken counterweight to the envoy's presence. They exchanged formalities, and then the envoy unrolled a scroll, sealed with the Senate's mark. His voice was calm, almost pleasant, but the words were honed to cut. Rome required certain assurances: the delivery of all navigational records of the Nile, unrestricted access to Alexandria's harbor, and the recall of any Roman officer currently serving Egypt in an advisory capacity. The silence that followed was deliberate. Cleopatra's gaze was steady, her fingers resting lightly on the carved arm of the throne. "And if Egypt declines?" she asked at last. The envoy's smile did not reach his eyes. "Then Rome will assume Egypt's refusal as a declaration of independence, and will respond accordingly." It was not a threat veiled in diplomacy. It was a gauntlet, laid in the open. Cleopatra rose slowly, each step toward the envoy measured. "Tell the Senate," she said, her voice low and clear, "that Egypt is not in the habit of giving away her rivers, and that a crown, once surrendered, is never returned." The envoy bowed, but his departure was fraught with the weight of promises yet to be kept. When the great doors closed behind him, the general met her eyes. Neither spoke of the choice now looming, but both felt the tide quickening beneath their feet.